All right. We're going to go ahead and kick off. We have a packed session here, fireside without the fire. It's very cozy. But I'm thrilled to be here today with our team and our partners from EdResearch for Action. And EdResearch for Action is a joint initiative between the Annenberg Institute at Brown University and Results for America. And they have a number of initiatives that you're going to be hearing about today at length from our speakers. But I really love the work that they are doing because I feel that it really truly exemplifies what we want to strive to be when we're thinking about knowledge brokers as organizations, right? We think about sometimes knowledge brokers as individuals, and sometimes it can kind of be challenging to mentally shift to this thought of how organizations can broker information. So I think today will be a really nice way for folks to kind of see how that plays out in action. And so today I am delighted to be joined by Shannon Garfield. She's CEO of the Special Education Leader Fellowship, and she serves on the EdResearch for Action Advisory Board. Christina Claiborne, who is the Research Project Director for EdResearch for Action, and Nate Schwartz, who is the Director of Applied Research and Professor of Practice at Brown University. And you're going to get to hear a little bit more about each of them today as we kick off here. But I'm just going to open the floor. I would love to hear a little bit more about the work that you all are doing and about your organization.
I'm going to start quickly and then pass over to Christina. But so Annenberg runs actually these three initiatives, of which Ed Research for Action is one of them. And all of them are aimed at making it easier to get accessible research in ways that actually allow you to look not just at single research studies, which I think is something that we are all pretty good at, but to actually think across research studies. And the one piece of quick background here, I spent a long time in the Tennessee Department of Education, and we used to think a lot about the right research partnerships. And when we built these research partnerships, they were often around individual studies. And at some point, it got increasingly frustrating that it was hard to take these individual studies and think about what do we do next as an organization. And I think that's because often we get sort of overly concerned as researchers with writing things that don't use research jargon, that don't talk too much about effect sizes. But we forget that the hardest part is not actually reading research jargon. The hardest part is putting a bunch of ideas together and saying, so what do we do with this? And so Annenberg tries to run these initiatives that make it easier to do that. And one of those is Ed Working Papers that hopefully some of you are subscribed to, which is just a roundup of all the newest education research. We publish about 300 working papers a year, and this is where you can see the newest studies. But then our other two pieces of this, Ed Research for Action that Christina runs, and Ed Instruments, are aimed at generating better consensus across researchers and policymakers and practitioners to help us use the same language and be able to say, how does this stuff go together? So Ed Instruments allows you to look at the types of measurement tools, surveys, teacher observation tools, these sorts of things that other people are using and pick and choose from those rather than creating your own new survey measures. And Ed Research for Action that Christina runs asks researchers and people like Shannon, policymakers, practitioners, school leaders, to think about a particular topic area and try to synthesize maybe the last decade's worth of research and try to figure out, so what does that say? If you were a district leader, what might you do next? What are the key choices that you're making if you want to be evidence aligned? So with that, I will pass to Christina to explain more.
Thanks, Nate. So I thought I would give you, since we have Shannon here, a little more information on EdResearch specifically. So like Nate said, this project really grew out of, our team's shared experience. Nate was working in a state department of education. I was working in a school district. And in these roles, we regularly faced practical questions like, what programs actually best support English learners, or how do we design those programs using what the research actually tells us? And like Nate said, we knew the research existed and we had training to read and analyze the papers, but actually connecting the dots across studies and then applying them in practical context is still a huge challenge, like very hard. We didn't have the answers right away. So when we look at traditional education research, there's a lot of good evidence out there, but it's often quite hard to use. And at EdResearch, we see four main challenges with using traditional research, and we try to address those in our briefs. So those challenges are, the first is that the evidence is scattered across many individual studies. And then much of the research actually looks at just specific pieces of the problem in isolation. And so it can be really difficult to just see how those pieces fit together and how they can actually guide practice and improve student outcomes. The second is that findings are often highly technical, and the key implications for practice can be pretty hard to even find in the study and then pull out and make sense of. The third is that often studies don't actually directly answer the questions that school and district leaders or people in our advisory board, like Shannon, are actually asking and they want answers to. Like what to implement, how to structure it, what it looks like in real classrooms. And then the last is that the practical details that are needed for implementation and actually like making these decisions, those things are often untested. So practitioners are left with these unanswered questions and sort of left to their own devices and how to make those decisions. So even though the strong research exists, it doesn't consistently shape day-to-day practice, and that's the gap that we're trying to solve. So we started EdResearch in 2020 to address these challenges. And we do a few different things, but the main thing that we do is we work with these researcher authors to write research synthesis briefs for the main audience of school and district leaders. And the briefs pull together what is known across studies and highlight where there's clear consensus in the field. So they try to work directly to address those four challenges that I just talked about. So instead of highly technical findings with buried takeaways, we translate the evidence into clear, actionable guidance. And we also use takeaways from like journalism and evidence translation. So we do things like format the brief so that the most important information is the easiest to find and the bottom line comes first, and sort of the inverted pyramid approach used in journalism. And then more details come after in bullet format. We collaborate directly with practitioners, mostly school and district leaders, to make sure that the briefs address the decisions that they're actually trying to make, which has led to some really interesting conversations. We have an advisory board of 16 of these people working in schools, and they advise us from start to finish on the briefs. And they ensure that the briefs, are addressing the right questions and including the most relevant evidence and get as specific as possible and actually offer insights that educators and policymakers can then, apply in their own contexts. Another thing that we do differently from other types of synthesis briefs is that we encourage our researcher authors to sort of put themselves in the shoes of district leaders and use their expert judgment when we don't have, a direct research answer to answer a question. So we ask them to use their professional judgment to then fill in the gaps, essentially, while also being transparent about where the evidence is strong and where it's still emerging. So we're really just encouraging them to move beyond simply restating the evidence and instead think critically about how the research findings can be actually, practically applied and how they're applied in different contexts. So the goal is pretty simple: make research easier to use. We're likely to shape real practice and policy. We have 38 briefs so far. We have about 6 in the works. And I will drop the link to the EdResearch website directly into the chat so you know where to find them if you're interested. And we have
I
a
think you
lot
did
more.
that, Christina.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Haven't
that
seen it. Oh,
Nate
thank
helped
you.
you out. Yeah.
Great. And we brought Shannon because we love our advisory board and they've really just moved the briefs so much and made them more applicable and practical. So we're really excited to have Shannon here and talk more about that process.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to actually skip to Shannon for a moment, and then I would love to hear a little bit more too, if there's time, about some examples of those who have been using your briefs. And for those in the audience, please check those links out because you can sign up to receive all these resources directly to your inbox. One came in today, so I'm excited to read mine. But the team here produces some really useful tools and resources, and would love to hear just a little bit, Shannon. We think about knowledge brokering as what we like to call a two-way street, right? Christina alluded to this a little bit already. It's not just about gathering the evidence, synthesizing the evidence and saying, here you go. Nate kind of alluded to this as well, right? It's okay, now what do we do? What now? So I'd love to hear a little bit about how your team is addressing that through your partnerships, the advisory board, and what that looks like for you. How does that knowledge exchange work in your world?
Thanks, Katie. So one of the main ways that happens is through the EdResearch for Action Advisory Board. So I sit on that board. I'm in my second year, and we are a group of district, state, and school leaders, and we stay closely involved in the work of the research and the briefs throughout the year. So in the beginning, we help to surface a problem of practice that might feel most urgent to a system or state or school where we're working. And then with our work with researchers and Christina and team, we play a role to really shape the topics of what is going to be prioritized next. And by engaging on the front end, the early input process makes us feel like that the team is really taking on the right questions to focus on and not producing a product or investing time or research or brief that feels disconnected from what's actually happening in schools on a daily basis. So as then the brief process it takes shape, we will then look at pieces of it to react to the emerging findings. We'll push on what might feels realistic. We'll start to name some of the tensions that we might see and surface between the research and implementation. And then we really work together to think about what that research means as it's practically ready for implementation and publication for schools and practitioners.
Let's talk about tension for a second. That's that's always a big one. How do you navigate that? What resources or what learnings have you all discovered through this process of working, across silos and across sectors?
Yeah, I mean, I would say from a big picture perspective, it's like this back and forth between what we're seeing, what researchers are seeing, what the team is seeing that really helps to strengthen the clarity and the practicality of the briefs, while also keep it really grounded in real conditions, and to make sure that what's being produced is able to translate in meaningful ways. Some of the tensions that emerge might be thinking about what are the underlying assumptions from the researcher that the different readers might interpret differently based upon their context of their school or district or network. Are there phrases or words that feel unrealistic or off-putting or disconnected to what implementers experience on a day-to-day that might vary where different folks are situated and working in the country. And so our work is really to pressure test and push on some of those assumptions. Um, Joining EdResearch for Action and the advisory board has been such a joyful moment of my professional career. I feel like I learn so much every time that we engage. But Christina and team always welcome us to put on our hats, different hats, so I can really be skeptical of the research in a way that I think really helps to refine the nuance of what's being published.
Can I just add? I think that's also because Shannon, right, is like someone who is generally, implementing the research and says, she would identify as a more like research consumer maybe than like the average practitioner by nature of applying to be on our board and wanting to work, in this space of research and practice. So she's not only like thinking through her personal, experience of how do we make this more applicable, but she's also trying to push it even farther. Like, what would someone who is maybe dealing with research less on the day to day, like what questions might they have? What might they be skeptical of? And it's a really hard thing to do. So we're so grateful to have Shannon and the rest of our board doing these things.
Can I
Nate,
add
did
one
you
more
want to
thing
add
too?
there?
I
Yeah,
do want
please
to
do.
add. I think this tension is the right question, right? And the tension that I continuously struggle with is how specific you want to be on the policy and practice side, and how general research often is. And so, to give a really concrete example, I've been thinking a lot about instructional coaching recently, and the research in instructional coaching is comparatively pretty strong compared with research in lots of other areas. We know a decent amount about instructional coaching. We've done lots of studies, and the big takeaway is that instructional coaching seems to work. When you have coaches assigned in one-on-one situations to teachers, we see students doing better. But there are like a million questions that don't get answered by any of that. If you want to run a coaching program that works, right? How much dosage? Which teachers do you target? Like, how do you think about costs? How do you think about opportunity costs? What could you invest in instead? And I think it is really, really hard for research to answer questions at a level of specificity that would help you design your coaching program in your school. And some of that will always be true. Some of that tension will always be there. But but I think we can get better at it. And I think it involves people like our advisory board really pushing and saying, here are the things that I would actually want to know. And then forcing researchers to move into a space where if we look across these 5 different studies, we don't have the perfect causal research, but we are able to say that we see different effects when we coach veteran teachers versus when we coach early career teachers. Or we know that coaches running PLCs is not actually the same as one-on-one coaching. And I think that researchers can get to those answers and can write these sorts of things, but only when pushed that those are actually the questions. And I think otherwise, we as researchers, and I'm deeply sort of in this category of making this mistake, will say sort of a broad takeaway like coaching is the way to go and leave it at that. And then it won't get you far enough to be able to create research aligned practice.
I appreciate those reflections. Lots of lessons for knowledge brokers in there. If folks would like to ask any questions, I'll just note we may have time to take one or two, so feel free to drop those in the chat. As you're talking, I really hear a couple things that I think are particularly relevant to knowledge brokering. And one is setting up the conditions, to, as Shannon said, to be skeptical, and so allowing a space where people can really be critical and questioning, and have that kind of open dialogue and wonder how that applies specifically to their context, I think is really, really powerful and such a nice example for folks to take away from your work. I think it's really amazing to see. I'm just going to check quickly. Brett noted, unless the district is in control, they have research. Yeah. Yeah. Good observation. Laura asked, do you have internal protocols or criteria that your board uses? A list of questions, a list of facets that you always look for in a report that means it's really actionable for a school district?
The answer is that we have an internal protocol and it changes monthly. I think that so we've had the board for almost 2 years. Before that, we would send the briefs to practitioners who we were already connected to, sort of like on an ad hoc basis, but we didn't have a board that was willing to like come together and discuss. So we have been involving practitioners for a while, but now that we have the board and now that we have people like Shannon who've been on the board for 2 years, they are more willing, I think, to give me feedback and say, like, this isn't the right question. I'm gonna give, I'm gonna respond in this way instead. So we do have sort of a normal list of questions, but it does change quite a bit. And one thing that we've learned and started to implement more recently is we used to do more like asynchronous feedback on the final version of a brief to mainly because I think I was like, oh, I think it would be easier for me if if I had time to look this over by myself and respond, in writing. But I realized that like I'm probably the minority, and the board really prefers to have a full conversation about the brief and sort of like play off of each other. For example, Shannon says like, oh, I didn't really understand this part. I interpreted it to mean X thing. And then another board member can say, like, oh, I interpreted it to be this. And in that way, we're sort of like getting closer and closer to something that, that is like as clear as possible and as specific as possible. So I think one of our main learnings is that like we can have a list of questions, but the more effective thing is to bring everyone into the same like synchronous group so that we can then have that like more organic conversation and get to the real decision points for that specific brief.
I can also add on that over the course of the last year and a half of working together, not only the mechanism for how we gave feedback or engaged in the briefs have changed, but the process has changed. Where I think when we started, the process of touch points for each brief was pretty formal and standardized. And I think something that we've learned along the way that Christina has led is that each brief actually requires a slightly different combination of engagement with Christina and the text and the research and the researchers, which is sometimes have been a combination of really formal touch points that are protocol driven, and then others have been the more informal touch points along the way.
Yeah, that's a
That's
good point.
great. It's really helpful to kind of have a peek into your process. We do have one other question in the Q&A, and I think we have time to probably wrap up with this. And it's one we grapple with a lot, I think, as knowledge brokers. I'm going to read it out. So, wondering how you communicate uncertainty in the evidence and quality of the evidence, or how do you ask research producers and authors to do this? That's a big one.
Okay, I have a few thoughts. I think the main thing
Christina,
is
I
that,
also just put it in an answer. I typed in an
oh,
answer. So you should answer, but you should also just know that I typed in some things and try not to say things that are directly contradictory of whatever I said.
okay. I can't see that. I don't know
Oh,
what
you
I
can't see mine? Anyway, no, you
I
you
only see
go.
the
We'll
chat.
see. We'll see whether we align. See whether you say the same
Okay.
thing. Go for it.
Yeah, gosh, this will be a test. No, the main thing was that I will, so hopefully this is kind of answering the question. I will really push authors to not have the main takeaway be there is mixed evidence on this thing. The main takeaway should be if you are writing on a brief like teacher induction and the preponderance of evidence shows that teacher induction programs are effective in certain conditions, then the main takeaway should be, you know, the majority of research says that teacher induction programs are effective, and then get into the details underneath about what we know about when they are effective and when they aren't. So, and I do think that like most traditional research studies will start with, this study said this, and then this study said this, and then this study said this, and then the bottom is like, and we don't really know. So we try to just to synthesize it in the most useful way possible up front for practitioners, and then get into the details as much as possible.
That's great. Yeah, I think I think you and Nate are well aligned there. So well done. I think that's a key question again for knowledge brokers is how do we help folks critically evaluate the relevance to their context, to their student populations, to their schools or situations. And I love, Nate, how you said, you don't necessarily rule out weaker evidence. It's just a matter of helping decision makers use that in ways that do no harm and can lead to further exploration. We are out of time. I knew it was going to go so fast. Thank you so much to our amazing panelists. Everyone, please feel free, drop other questions in our Padlet. We have a 5-minute break here, and then we're going to come back to our concurrent session. So be sure to pick your next session before you take a break.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Q&A now at the end when we're done.
I did not realize that Q&A was open, so I'm glad Carolyn caught that for us. So, we're learning so much about Zoom as we go through here. I'm going to stop.